Hello, dears. Thank you so much for joining us. Today is very sunny day, and we hope you're enjoying our program. Welcome to the Philosophical Talks with Stephen Friedman. Today we have a very interesting topic, and you might find it very useful. So join us, please. It is about entrepreneurship. So let me introduce the speaker, the legendary Stephen Friedman. Thank you so much for joining. And by the way, it's still November 26th in LA, like in California, and we are congratulating you with the Thanksgiving Day. So thank you so much for leading this program. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Today is still Thanksgiving Day. And one thing I just wanted to say as an introduction before I do the actual introduction that I had planned is that Thanksgiving was first introduced by Abraham Lincoln as a federal holiday. And that establishes a connection, of today to one of the, if not the greatest of American presidents, somebody that I've spoken about on a number of occasions. Last week, I was mentioning that the World Philosophy Day that we were celebrating was also the anniversary of Lincoln's delivery of the Gettysburg Address, one of the great documents in American history, one of the great speeches ever delivered, certainly within American governmental issue, within the context of American governmental concerns. So it's a connection, right? Thanksgiving Day celebration, Abraham Lincoln. Those kinds of connections are what I call convergences. Those are the connections that make something interesting. They're the connections that make ultimately something powerful. And they're going to be the connections that drive successful entrepreneurship, as we'll see, as well as successful creativity in any direction. Okay, I would like, at the start here, to begin by thanking, again, everyone involved at the consulate in Almaty, the US consulate in Almaty, everyone involved in making these talks possible. That includes Tracy, Elmira, Consul General Eric Meyer, Kimbut. And tonight in particular, I want to extend a special appreciation to Sharon, who has been moderating these talks since their start a few months ago, and who will be leaving us tonight as the moderator. Sharon has been indispensable to the development of these talks, their execution, their implementation. She's been involved in the design, the visual design of them, the incorporation of commentary, as you're watching the talks. She does introductions, obviously, and has been moderating questions. And so she's been indispensable to however successful they've been so far. So I'm enormously appreciative of her role. In addition, when she told me a couple of weeks ago that she was going to be leaving for another position, I was sad. And that kind of sadness, that kind of emotion is also central to creative effort. It is central to philosophical effort. It's central to religious motivations. There's a famous comment someone's made about Mozart, the composer Mozart, who spent much of his life traveling around Europe. In those days, and even as today, certainly prior to the pandemic, composers, musicians would go to different cities, venues, and perform. That was how Mozart survived. That's how he supported himself. So he was constantly traveling, which meant he was constantly saying goodbyes. And for him, parting, absence were sad. They were heartrending because they were tokens of death. Yes, I know that sounds dramatic, but that's the nature of how human beings really experience these kinds of things, tokens of something much deeper. That's certainly how philosophy addresses them and comes to terms with them. That was the fundamental motivation for Buddhism. The notion, Siddhartha's notion, concern that the people around him that were dearest to him, his parents, would one day be separated from him, be separated if only by death. And that was, again, so heartrending that it motivated the development, the elaboration of the philosophical and religious response of Buddhism to the circumstances of human life. Before I developed the philosophy to the degree that I now have, the end of every evening, no matter what I was doing, especially if I was out with friends, if I went to a movie, whatever I might have been doing, I met with, again, an aching sadness. Okay? It was that sense of things coming to an end that is painful for human beings. It's painful to the degree that Kierkegaard, the great 19th century Danish philosopher, now considered one of the greatest of all philosophers, certainly one of the greatest of all philosophers in the Western tradition, was a Christian, was a Protestant Christian. Much of his philosophical work did not directly address Christianity until more towards the end. And in his final works, called Edifying Discourses, he addressed some of these fundamental, deep human concerns, and one of his most famous was on the unchangeableness of God. And for him, and you see this throughout the philosophical tradition, the issue of addressing change and the anguish and the anxiety and the pain of change was what ultimately supported his relationship to the Christian concept of God, that which for him embodied the unchangeableness, behind the world of change. One of the main points here is that philosophy, even as it seems like it's addressing what we might call it esoteric, like difficult, abstract, unusual kinds of concerns that are so abstract because they have to apply to everything that they seem remote from daily experience, daily concerns, is ultimately addressing those abstractions in order to deal with the daily. If it cannot successfully address, our normal kinds of issues, stresses, anxieties, it's not adequate to our needs. There's a famous example, the philosopher Wittgenstein. I like to refer to Wittgenstein because he was a major influence upon my thought and is considered, at this point, arguably the greatest of 20th century philosophers. When he was at Cambridge, a professor in the late 30s, the 1930s, had a student, Norman Malcolm, who went on to become a professor of philosophy at Cornell. Norman Malcolm might be, at this point, most celebrated for a short biography he wrote about Wittgenstein called Wittgenstein, a Memoir, that when I was in college, basically everybody interested in Wittgenstein read. It's the main source of my information about Wittgenstein, the man, the personality, what he was like. apart from his philosophical efforts. Well, Norman Malcolm was a student at Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein became friends with some of his students and was especially close to Norman Malcolm. Well, at one point, as the world was approaching World War II, Malcolm made a comment to Wittgenstein about the German national character. Wittgenstein ended their relationship when he heard that comment. He was prepared to end it permanently. It turns out their estrangement from each other lasted for about 2 years. But Wittgenstein's reaction when he heard that was, as difficult as it is to think about philosophical issues, questions of the nature of language, of logic, of mathematics, of proposition, it's even more difficult to think about circumstances of daily life and to apply philosophical thinking to those conditions, those circumstances. Wittgenstein felt that that notion of German national character, that concept, represented a fundamental misunderstanding of everything Wittgenstein had been teaching about the nature of language, about how our concepts function. And it was enough to separate, divorce himself from Malcolm. Okay? So it's just an illustration of the degree to which philosophy matters here and now. The issue of parting, of things coming to an end, haunted me to the point where one night, as I was in the earlier stages of developing my philosophical work, I went to a Michael Jackson concert. Okay? And it turns out, I might have mentioned this, I tutor people. I teach mostly one-on-one. And some of my students were like actors, actresses, in doing various television shows that would take them away from normal school, and I would, serve as their instructor. Okay. One of those students was an American actor, Emmanuel Lewis, who was in a show in the 90s called Webster, very popular show. And it turns out that Emmanuel Lewis was friends with Michael Jackson, the singer. So on one of Michael Jackson's tours, I think it was the Bad Tour, I was over at Emmanuel Lewis's house. I was helping him. And there's activity in the background and there are phone calls, and suddenly, somebody sort of yells out to me, "Would you like tickets to the Michael Jackson concert tomorrow night," or whatever. Okay, I wasn't really a fan so much of popular music at that point. I've exposed myself much more now. I was more a fan of classical music, but the opportunity to see Michael Jackson in concert was a rare opportunity. And since these tickets were coming from a good friend of his, they were excellent seats, right? So it was up to that time the most memorable concert experience I had had. And by the end of the night, as the concert was approaching its end, I was profoundly sad. And what often would happen in those days, and I think I've mentioned that this happens just as it's the way in which I write philosophy, aphorisms, thoughts would come to me. And they would come to me usually in their sort of finished form, partly because of how much thinking I might have been doing in relation to them, leading up to their emergence, their appearing in my mind. Well, the aphorism that came to my mind as I was in sort of pain in sadness about the ending of the night and the concert was, "Do not suffer that it ends. It was not redemption." The idea being that whatever can end is not ultimately powerful enough to address our deepest needs, our most fundamental needs, the needs that the great religions, that philosophy at its limit is seeking to address. And I find that turns out to be, even though it's not providing an answer directly, it has, from that point forward, been capable of allaying, my sort of disquiet at endings and sort of taking me out of that state of sadness. Now, there are other aphorisms too that I've written that relate to that. For loss, there is no consolation. So far as we can say, there is no loss. For example, in the question of death, and this is something that I've addressed. I don't know how many of you might have seen Phalaris's Bull that was available last week as part of World Philosophy Day. But in that play, I talk about this notion of, well, death. If someone dies, what do you know, really know, that they will not return to the end of all time? You know that? How do you know that? The answer, of course, is that you don't. And more broadly, in terms of any of these sadnesses or pains of any kind, physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, whatever the disquiet is, whatever the discomfort, whatever the pain, whatever the anguish is, it points, and there are several ways to say this. One way to say it is, any pain that you're experiencing is an indication that your thinking is located in heuristic space, the space of approximations between things, not rigorous space, not philosophic space, not the religious space that philosophy achieves at the limit of rigor, not epistemic space. You can use your pain, your anguish, your dissatisfactions, your despair as a diagnostic that you haven't achieved philosophically the limit of rigor. Now, if you're operating within the religious tradition, you would use that pain, those degrees of anguish, physical or otherwise, as an indication of your separation from God, let's say, within the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. Or if you're a Buddhist, as an indication that you haven't fully understood the nature of change. And so the true nature of the world that we're in. But also that sense of, I should mention too, that Socratic sense. And there's a link right between Socrates and Steve Jobs that I've mentioned in the past. I'm going to be talking about Steve Jobs in a little bit. The statement Steve Jobs made that he would trade all of his technology, including the iPhone, for an afternoon with Socrates. Well, what summarizes the Socratic relationship to the world, the Socratic response to all the trials and stresses and anguishes of human life. What I summarize in an aphorism that relates to Socrates' thinking, we suffer, and I've mentioned this before, we suffer not because of what we know, and not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. The point of philosophy is to remove us from that realm of false claims, inadequate claims, non-rigorous claims about the world. And the contention, my contention, is that all of our suffering is grounded in those types of claims, and that to extricate ourselves, remove ourselves, free ourselves from those claims, those unjustifiable presumptions, theories, beliefs that don't rise to the level of rigor, that is the solution that we seek. And finally, I've talked a lot about the relationship of past to future, our sense of past to future, that the past cannot guarantee the future decides the past, right? I've talked about how we suffer, that we wallpaper the future with prints from the past, and then marvel at our dissatisfactions. That's at the core of our inability to free ourselves from past sort of notions, ways of thinking. The entrepreneur is largely attempting to free himself from some of those past responses in order to achieve solutions to issues, to problems that have not previously been arrived at. Okay? But again, when we feel a sadness, when I feel a sadness that chagrin will not be moderating, I'm looking backwards. I'm not looking forward. And it's the essence of our condition, ultimately in heuristic space, to look forward. We need to be looking forward because it's the future that decides. It's the future that, if you like, in certain religious contexts, redeems. And so, for example, as a response to these circumstances, to Sharin's no longer participating in these talks, we will be discussing some projects to do together. Maybe on mental health, some talks in different contexts or different formats. So one of the main responses to the anguish that a focus on the past can produce is instead to turn around and look forward. And that's what philosophy certainly embraces. And again, those aphorisms, the past cannot guarantee the future decides the past, are one way of summarizing the philosophical solution to the world. One way. Okay. Now, so again, my deepest appreciation for Sharin's involvement, and all the help she's provided. Okay, I will be missing her. Okay. Now what I'd like to do is turn to, I think there were two questions that were left over from last week. One question, I don't have the specific question, was about our relationship to nature, to the beauty of nature, to the sublime in nature, and the degree to which really human activities may compromise that. Okay. There are a few things to be said about that. First, the sublime is an important concept, actually, that was especially entertained in the early 19th century, late 18th century. It's characteristic of romanticism, not as an intellectual movement that was a response partly to what we're seeing as the constraints, the limitations of the scientific vision that had been elaborated by Newton and his followers and had become the prevailing way of thinking about the world. Romanticism stressed emotion, it stressed the unboundedness of things. And nature, in many of its installments, many aspects of nature, can provide an image of that unboundedness, the horizon that we see, the sky, the mountains that suggest, like almost a limitless expanse beyond, plains that are sort of open and vast before our eyes, the ocean. These are things that approximate, become a symbol, a visual symbol of what the Romantics called, especially called, the sublime. Well, it's an issue that it connects with so the sublime connects with what we might call the romantic, at least in the sense of romanticism, that movement. I talk a little bit about that in the play Phalaris' Bull, that the romantic is the unbounded, that philosophy establishes the unbounded, incontestably, a truth more than beauty, pure and true romance, that unlimitedness to things, that, again, nature can suggest, can embody. This was especially sought by painters of the early 19th century. There was a great German artist, sort of underappreciated because of other later developments in the history of Western art, Caspar David Friedrich, who used nature, paintings of distant mountains, of vast expanses, to suggest the sublimity of nature and ultimately to suggest God. He was really painting God, you know. And the sublime is one of those concepts that in its openness, in its aspiration, sort of leads in that direction, right? Leads us outside of ourselves. But probably the most striking, the most compelling image I've ever experienced was one day on television. I turned on the television set and I saw like a silver expanse. The camera showing the silver expanse, almost like a mirror, you know, covering the sea. It was extraordinary. And I've never been quite so visually struck by an image before. I didn't know what it was. It was strange, but it was sublime. Well, it was an oil slick, is what it was. They were covering a story about an oil spill, and that was the oil on the ocean, shimmering like a mirror. The point is that we tend to make fairly narrow judgments about beauty, about value in nature. I've often stressed philosophically that one of our fundamental illusions, one of the ways to sort of encapsulate what we are doing wrong in our thinking that sort of entraps us in confusions and in pain of all different varieties is the belief that we can leave the world to see the world. The circumstance that we can effectively see the world from the outside. That's our notion of reality, but a scientific reality is typically based on that view, the world seen from the outside, the world seen from a third person perspective. And even though it's sort of natural for us to think in those terms, that's what our concept of reality actually enshrines, that notion. That's what language is sort of promoting, that sense of our participating in a shared space, right? Where it's not just about us, it's about a community. Remember, language exists not to facilitate, not to make possible communication between human beings, but to make possible coordination of actions, of efforts. Again, the type of coordination that is central to so much of the entrepreneurial enterprise that, again, I will be speaking about directly soon. The point is that we are within the world. We cannot leave the world no matter what. And anything in the world has an effect upon the world. Anything in the world changes the world in ways that are impossible to perfectly assess because we can't do the experiments to do the assessment. We can do the experiments approximately, but not rigorously. And when we're talking about ultimate solutions to things, it's only rigor that matters, that really matters? Well, every type of living thing has changed the world. The world was at one time, the earth was a desolate landscape on land until photosynthesizing organisms in the ocean created a layer, a percentage of oxygen in the air. Now the air is 20% oxygen. At one time, it was effectively 0% oxygen, so far as we know. That 20% level of oxygen was capable of generating an ozone layer that was capable of protecting life on land from ultra radiation from the sun that is damaging to the DNA of organisms, from single-celled organisms to ourselves. So at one time, there was no life on land, there were no green plants, the world was not green as it is now. Green has come about because of the byproduct, the waste product, if you like, of living things. Our waste products, if you like, the debris that we introduce to the world, even if it's in terms of our technology, well, we don't know where that might lead. We think of it, I mean, it may be harmful to us, yes. I mean, there's this concept of ecological succession, that every type of life form can modify the world in such a way that it's the environment is no longer compatible to that life form, but some other form that then takes over. Well, that may be our fate ultimately as well. It's, again, the future decides the past. I mean, there's another way to put it is, so far as we know, the reality hasn't yet begun. Like what is of ultimate significance may not yet have appeared so far as we can know. So we may be, our waste, our debris, our oil slicks, our disturbances of the environment may create conditions somewhere, sometime, for the emergence of something different, almost certainly greater, possibly in some sense of great. Our evaluation of the greatness of things is, ultimately connected to our needs, our interests, our judgments. But the point is that we should not sort of recoil, even from the changes that our technology produces. I am open to the beauty even of what we typically think of as disasters, because they can be the conditions that lead to the next great development. We, this Earth, this solar system, is the product of disasters in distant stars. All the elements, the heavy elements, the elements that we are made of, carbon and nitrogen and sulfur and phosphorus, we would have called these heavy elements heavier than hydrogen and helium, where the thinking is formed in distant stars, eons ago, billions of years ago, and were released into other regions of the universe when stars exploded. So disasters, like the exploding of stars, can give rise to us. Okay, so we want to be open to the sublime in all its forms, including emerging forms. Okay, so another question, I think the next question, I think we have just one more question, and that is about, I think, Roman philosophers that I admire, respect. Roman philosophy tends to have centered on Stoicism in various forms, or that's among the most celebrated. For me, and I'll answer this in relation to my personal experience. The most important, the greatest of Roman philosophers was the emperor, Marcus Aurelius, a Stoic philosopher. I recommend reading the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. When I was in high school, when I was on my way to college, that was one of the books that calmed me. That was one of the books that fortified me against change, against the stresses, of life, of novelty, right? Of the demands of life. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor dealing with some of the most urgent demands, that a human being, has had to address. And his philosophy was his means, ultimately, of coming to terms with his life, his responsibilities. And he would write that philosophy even when he was on the battlefield, defending the frontiers of the Roman Empire. Some of his books were written, under the stress, the extremity of warfare, which means they were tested. Aurelius was always able to test his thoughts. I think I might have mentioned to you that even though philosophy ultimately is just interested in a rigorous representation of the world and does not need to do anything to help our condition, that's not its goal, I early on discovered that my work had that power, right, to address daily issues, concerns, anxieties, fears. I mentioned in Aphorism selflessness, how one acts not out of need, that I discovered one day early on was able to extinguish my acrophobia, my fear of heights, and worked in other situations too. It was able to allay physical pain. It was able to allay any kind of emotional pain, like instantaneously, like a switch. It would turn off. It was successful up until the moment of death that I experienced during the Northridge earthquake. Again, it's something I talked about in Phalaris's Bull, where that aphorism when I was writing my philosophy for many years, I would use any occasion of stress, of anxiety as a test. Is the philosophy strong enough to address it, to turn it off like a switch? And that aphorism in particular was successful at addressing everything I asked of it, except during the earthquake, when a wall in my apartment collapsed, when I was waiting for the ceiling to collapse, and I was anticipating dying any instant. And it turns out there was a supporting wall that was ajar. If it had shifted another half inch or so, I was told, the apartment building would have collapsed on me, and I would likely have not survived. Well, that aphorism I mentioned, selflessness, how one acts not out of need, did not allay the anxiety of that moment. But I went to, at the time, what was an aphorism closer to the core of the philosophical thought as I was writing it at that moment, and that was a logical aphorism. The meaning of the world is its most general representation, not something that would seemingly be connected to the anxiety of impending death and the stress of, the horrific shaking, the violence of an earthquake. Because where I was in Los Angeles, in the San Fernando Valley, was not Northridge. It was about 10 miles from the epicenter, Northridge, but it was in the area of the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles that, according to geological analyses afterwards, analyses by Caltech, a main institution that studies earthquakes and monitors and analyzes them, was the area with the second most violent shaking. So it was literally, potentially a moment of death. And that aphorism shut off the anxiety, okay, like a switch. If it hadn't, I wouldn't be here talking about the philosophy, because I demanded that it be able to rise to any occasion. Okay? Well, Marcus Aurelius' Stoicism was subject to that same demand. And again, I recommend it. The person who taught Marcus Aurelius, and it's a remarkable story, was a Greek philosopher. The Roman Empire had conquered Greece, and a lot of Greek philosophers would come to Rome looking for teaching positions. They often came as slaves, but that didn't mean that they were slaves, in the way that African Americans in the early part of U.S. history, were slaves. They were not living under those extremity of circumstances. They were often part of noble households. Certainly in the case of Epitidus, the teacher of Marcus Aurelius. And Epitidus's works have come down to us primarily through conversations that were preserved by students of his. There's one set of writings called the Enchiridion that, again, I recommend. And at this point, honestly, I find Epitidus even more powerful as a writer, as a source of consolation. He famously wrote, and I make a reference to it also in Phalaris's Bull, "Remember, you are an actor in such a play as the author may choose. If short, in a short one. If long, in a long one. If you are called to act the part of a poor person, of a merchant, of a governor, see that you act well the given part. For that is your duty, to act well the assigned part. But to select it belongs to another. Belongs, it's often said, to God, let's say. I mean, this kind of comports with one of my aphorisms. Certain things are not in our control, right? We like existentially have the ability to choose, and we have to rely upon our own sense of our circumstances to make choices. We can't use anybody else's guidance fully because they don't know our circumstances in sufficient detail, not rigorously. But there's an aphorism: no one deserves to suffer, not having asked to be born. That is like one of the fundamental impulses, behind my philosophical writing. And it also relates to this notion that philosophically, rigorously, we can't judge. We don't know another's circumstances in sufficient detail to render a rigorously justifiable judgment. Okay, so Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus are the two Roman philosophers. One Roman, for sure, the other of Greek, but living in Rome, teaching the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And again, it's an extraordinary intersection, convergence. A Greek slave teaching a Roman emperor. So, okay, now we will turn to entrepreneurship. That was kind of a lengthy, build up, but I've already kind of said some things that do kind of relate to this whole issue. Okay, first of all, I want to say that entrepreneurship, like any creative activity done at a high level, is aiming highly. When I give talks and people ask me what I think what people should be doing, if I'm talking to a class of like high school students and they want to know what my sense of human responsibility is, it's very simple. Our responsibility, each and every one of us, is to save the world as best we can from where we stand, given our means, our inclinations, our capacities. Okay? Save the world. Entrepreneurs are aspirational. I mean, many, the best, the greatest, a Steve Jobs, an Elon Musk, are aspirational in that way. There's a famous story, it's true, of Steve Jobs admiring John Scully, who was the CEO of, I think it was Pepsi. It was like Pepsi or Coca-Cola, I think it was Pepsi. Steve Jobs admired Scully and felt that he would be an invaluable addition to Apple and to moving the company forward and having it grow to its potential. And he went to Scully and basically sold him on the idea of leaving the soft drink company to work for the computer company, saying to him, you want to spend your life making sugar water? That's your ambition? That's the height of your ambition? That's how you're going to save the world? Now, of course, when I say save the world, one thing that's interesting about that is you think, again, religiously in terms of religious categories, we think certainly within, again, the Judeo-Christian tradition of Messiah, that concept, Savior, right? One of the interesting things about that, as philosophy sees that concept, is it operates in an epistemic space. In an epistemic space, and again, if all of this is not totally clear, just hearing it, I think, is helpful. An epistemic space has no concepts. It's something that I've talked about before and we'll talk about again. Which means, in terms of that concept, Messiah, from the outside, looking into it, no one could know that they are the Messiah, and no one can know that they are not. That's the beauty of it. In terms of, somebody asked me about the butterfly effect not too long ago. Well, how that connects to what I'm saying here is, so far as we know, a gesture can save the world. The right gesture at the right time, the right word at the right time, the right action at the right time can lead, can trigger a series of effects that ultimately magnify and magnify and magnify and save the world, so far as we can ever know. But the great entrepreneurs, above all, are visionaries. There's a famous kind of quip, comment by Henry Ford. He said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Henry Ford, basically launched the automobile industry, certainly in the United States. If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. The point is that visionaries in any field, visionaries in the entrepreneurial world, in the business world, visionaries in the creative arts, visionaries in philosophy, visionaries in any human area of activity, lead. They don't follow. That's what we value them most for. There are a number of instances, number of anecdotes about that related to Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs famously did not use focus groups, didn't sort of do market research to see what type of product should Apple be introducing to the world. When he designed, conceived the iPhone, he was responding to his own interests, his own needs, his own sense of what would most satisfy him, his concerns. And it's not that hard to understand that process. I mean, I remember before the iPhone came out. I mean, I was not in that field, not going to develop. I'm not positioned even to begin to develop an iPhone, back, in the, I guess, in the early 2000s, right? First came out, I think, around 2006, maybe. But the idea that, Steve Jobs said to himself, okay, what would I like to hold in my hand? I would like a phone that's also an iPod, can play music, a music library, that's also a computer that can search the web, that's also, well, we can go on from there now, a camera, a compass, and everything we need in the palm of our hands. And have it be an instrument, a device that above all was reliable, worked well, was more or less glitch-free. In the early 2000s, I remember I was drawn to smartphones because I liked the idea of having such a thing in my hand. In particular, I didn't like watches. I never liked having things on my wrist. So I liked the idea of having a phone that could tell the time. I loved that aspect of the phone as much as any. I liked, when it reached that point, having a calculator in my phone, in my hand, because I'm doing various kinds of calculations in different directions. I liked that concept. Well, one thing to notice about that, by the way, is how highly convergent all of that is. We talk about entrepreneurs basically creating objects, creating technologies, having goals. Anytime we're talking about a goal, an object that we're striving for, something that we're trying to create, it is a convergent result. And that applies not just at the level of a technology, not just at the level of what Elon Musk is creating and the technologies that he's developing, not just what Steve Jobs was creating. It applies to what Picasso was creating. It applies to what a musician is creating. Any creative product, any result, any object is a convergent result, something that has a number of elements that are brought together. Okay? But to go back, I remember in the early days of the smartphone, they were unreliable. They were glitchy. So just the idea that an iPhone, a phone, could emerge that was consistently reliable in its operation was itself enough to represent a visionary advance, an entrepreneurial advance. But again, Steve Jobs was not seemingly, in his own mind, creating something minor. I mean, when he makes that comment about exchanging his technology for Socrates' discourse, Socrates' insights, well, again, we're looking for maybe a deeper level of salvation. But still, Steve Jobs is aiming high. He's aiming for something that can fundamentally transform our lives and transform them so much for the better that if it doesn't save us, can affect, can promote our salvation, let's say, by becoming instruments that can lead others to successfully imagine, engineer, realize solutions to pressing human concerns. The one thing about that convergent process of creation, you see that in Steve Jobs. You see that Steve Jobs was interested in art. He was interested in aesthetics, right? One of the things that distinguished the iPhone, that helped make it the cornerstone of what became, for a time at least, the single most highly valued company in the world, in the history of the world, was that it was a beautiful work. So the aesthetic dimension became convergent in Steve Jobs' thinking. There's a story that one of my roommates in college told me. He had read a book about Steve Jobs. In fact, Walter Isaacson, the biographer of Steve Jobs, was in my class in college. And I didn't know him, but people that I know knew him. And so I ended up hearing some stories. One was that apparently when it's might apply to the iPhone, it might apply to computers. At some point of assembly, Steve Jobs looked and saw the internal sort of assembly, of one of his devices, one of Apple's devices, and thought that the internal assembly that no one would see, no consumer would see, wasn't aesthetically satisfying, wasn't pretty enough. He wanted it changed. He wanted even what could not be seen, could not be experienced by the user to satisfy his aesthetic standards. You see, like how convergent things are. When we talk about entrepreneurs, I often say that vision is the indispensable virtue, right? But it has to be combined with lots of other virtues. And there's no limit to the number of virtues that may converge to create a successful enterprise. The iPhone was successful not just because of its attention to quality of performance, not just because it was embracing a new concept, the concept of bringing together all of these functions in a handheld device, not just because of its beauty, but because of how it was marketed, because of how it was introduced to the world, because of its screen, because of all of these factors. We sometimes think that there's a key to something. Well, what we don't really keep in mind is that the key itself is a carefully engineered convergence of different angles and sides and facets. It's not just you put together something and there's the key. A key to be able to open a door is carefully engineered. It's highly convergent. I mean, at one time, probably locks were the most complicated of human devices. And the key to open a lock represented a high sort of technological type of exercise. Well, so keys are not simple. If the vaccines that are in development, right, and many of which seem to be, successfully in development, turn out to help end the pandemic, maybe decisively end the pandemic, it's not that was a simple key. Look at all the convergent elements and all the history of the molecular biology and the virology and the medicine. All of that had to converge to execute a successful vaccine. So even when we have a single something that can answer our needs, it's a highly convergent, robust object of many, many factors brought together. Okay? Same thing in general is true of any strong, successful object. And a company, an enterprise, a business. And the more successful it is, the more robust it is, the more highly convergent it is. When people say that the devil is in the details, it simply means the more one attends to, the more successful one is likely to be. Now, one thing to keep in mind whenever we're talking about entrepreneurial endeavor, we're dealing in heuristic space. We're talking about convergences. We're talking about creating new things and new things under new circumstances. And when I say new circumstances, I mean the next moment is a new circumstance rigorously. The one thing that is true about anything that's not epistemic, that's not rigorous at its limit, that's not philosophy per se in its purest form, is it's heuristic, which means it's not rigorous, which means we can't know for sure in advance ever if it's going to work. if it's going to work as a product, if it's going to work as a product that appeals to human beings. Everything in the realm of the heuristic has to be tested. We can't know in advance prior to the testing. The one thing that we do have as an operating principle, and this governs heuristic space, is that some order of convergence will achieve a given desired result. We don't always know what that's going to be, right? And we don't know how much effort might be involved in doing it. All we know is that we can never be justified in a heuristic space in giving up. It's the lesson of Thomas Edison, the great American inventor. He apparently tried something on the order of 10,000 filaments before he successfully was able to engineer the modern light bulb, or the light bulb that was able to light cities, 125 years ago, 30 years ago. In that regard, it's interesting. At the end of the 19th century, around the time that Edison, was working on his light bulb, people were also working, as they had been for hundreds of years, on developing airplanes. Leonardo da Vinci, famously was associated with this obsession to engineer a heavier than air craft, right? Could fly. It had been a desire, of mankind, of humankind, so far as we know, since its inception, right? Well, by the end of the 19th century, there were articles appearing in physics journals, respectable physics journals, major leading journals of physics, proving, theoretically, based upon fundamental principles of physics, that the airplane, as we know, the heavier than air flying machine, was impossible, could not be created. And those articles were being written in response to the failure to achieve such an invention. Proved, okay? Impossible. So, the point is, in heuristic space, you can't ever know in advance. The only time you are assured of not being able to achieve a result is if you give up, literally. But again, because it's heuristic and not epistemic, because it's not rigorous, we can't ever know in advance. It must be tested, and it must be tested to have a successful product in the marketplace. Okay? That's the nature, of entrepreneurship. Okay? But again, the more elements we add together, the stronger those elements, the greater the attention to detail, the greater the aspiration to achieve a beautiful product, or the greater the aspiration to engineer an efficient product, or a product that can do what has not been done before at a level or a degree of competence. Elon Musk is not, in general, inventing fundamentally new technologies. What he's doing is scaling them up. Scaling them up so that they can achieve results that have not been achieved before. And one interesting things, so as I mentioned, Elon Musk is, a friend of mine told me the other day, she'd been reading some things about Elon Musk's background, and that I'm not highly conversant with, honestly. But she was saying that when he was young, he read. He read everything he could. He read an encyclopedia, because you don't know. You don't know what's going to feed in to a robust, a strong result, a strong object. You don't know what may be useful, right? You hear that, we are living in an age of specialization. You have to specialize. Well, you can specialize in terms of a given line of emphasis or focus, but the more things that feed into that, the more likely you are to achieve results that are stronger and greater than what's been achieved before. If Einstein had focused just on physics, conventional physics, without adding a significant component, convergent component of philosophy, philosophical understanding, philosophical reading and study, we would not be talking about Einstein in contemporary society. I've heard of him. So entrepreneurship demands convergence. It demands bringing together, but it typically demands bringing together in the service of an ambitious vision. The more ambitious, the greater the potential result. And what ambition are these individuals that we know of typically serving? An ambition to save the world as best they can from where they stand. That's really the only enterprise that's worthy of us, that level of ambition. Now, of course, if we aim that high, we're likely to spend most of our time falling short, right? I've mentioned Andre Malraux's Anti-Memoirs, that 20th century work that was a major influence upon my thinking, my philosophical writing. In that work, Malraux makes the comment, if you aim high enough, most of your life will be a failure. Churchill spent most of his years out of power. Okay? So there is that risk. There's also a few admonitions that come to mind. There's a famous Silicon Valley admonition. Just when you're at the point of giving up, you're almost there. So perseverance, we hear that endlessly, by great creators, great entrepreneurs. And you can say, well, when do you know it's time to go in a different direction? You never know. Okay? You never know. Howard Schultz, the founder of Starbucks, I might have mentioned this, is associated with a very famous number in Silicon Valley, 242. 242 is the number of rejections Howard Schultz got from venture capitalists before number 243 said yes to funding Starbucks. Now, one thing about that repeated effort, and I've mentioned this before too, it's never exactly the same, because every time we do something, it's a little bit different. And any given difference may turn out to be the decisive difference. It's the principle of the battering ram, right? Every time you try to bang through a wall or a wall with a battering ram, the effort is different because it's against the background of having done it one more time. And each additional time, can be the decisive time. It's also, in general, the case that we learn or can learn from successive attempts. I had a business manager at one time who told me that, let's say you're interested in interviewing for a job position, let's say. Always go to like a less desirable interview, like one that's not your most desirable job first. Go to, like your third or your fourth most desirable sort of opening. Because each time you go through an interview, you can learn from that process. And that can prepare you for the time when you finally go in to interview for the job that you most want. Okay? It's a learning experience. Okay? And we want to learn from those experiences. That changes everything. And again, at some point, the decisive change can be achieved that makes success possible. And so, but we need to be guided typically by a mission, by a vision. It's one of the things that keeps, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, sort of moving forward in the face of resistance or in the face of failure. that there has to be some like fundamental confidence, right, in what you're doing, some commitment, but it's the same kind of commitment of, say, an artist to his art. I mean, we look at Van Gogh as an example of an artist who lived a tragic life and was tragically not appreciated, embraced by anyone, by the art community, by the general public in his lifetime, right? But when Van Gogh was leaving the Netherlands to go to Paris to study painting at the center of the Parisian Renaissance in painting in the late 19th century, he stopped off at an uncle's house in the Netherlands, and he brought the uncle 2 paintings as a parting gift. This is before Van Gogh had done any of the works really for which he's now famous. He hadn't signed the paintings. Van Gogh did not sign a lot of his art. His uncle said, "Vincent, could you please sign these?" Right? And Van Gogh said, "It's not necessary. One day, everyone will know my name. Everyone will know my art." Well, he was right. Now, there may be lots of artists that we never hear of that feel that same way. But the fact is, Van Gogh's life is not tragic in the way that we sometimes think from the outside, because he knew the value of what he was doing. He was convinced of the magnitude of his ambitions and his achievement. I mean, he said famously, "I want to paint men and women with that something of the eternal," which the halo used to symbolize, and which we seek to give through the actual vibration and intensity of our coloring. Okay? He aimed high. What was he aiming for? What did the halo that he was trying to engender? Salvation. Wanted to save the world. He'd been a priest before a preacher, before he turned to art. Not a successful preacher, but he was devoted to it. So he was motivated by a kind of religious intensity that guided everything he did, including his art. He just wasn't painting pretty pictures or trying to paint pretty pictures. He was trying to save humanity through his art. And again, you say, well, how can you have that kind of ambition, save the world through art? Well, because people see it, and they're changed in some way, and that changes their behavior, their vision, and they do things because of those changes. It's, again, if you like, the butterfly effect, ramifying throughout the world, potentially, right? And you don't know what the effects are going to be. Okay, I want to, we're coming probably closer to the end. I wanted to say something, I don't know if we'll have time. I had an encounter, kind of entrepreneurial encounter, with the company IKEA, the furniture company. I wanted to give you some insights into their patterns of decision-making, their relationship to the world. First of all, I am a visual artist. You can see some of my art behind me. I want to show you, just to give you a quick background. When I first started doing art, I was doing like pastels, this is a pastel portrait, right? It's chalk. Now, one of the things about it, you'll notice it's like the colors aren't too intense because it's chalk. And so the surface is granular. Okay, so when you look at it under a magnifying glass, it's not precise. Okay, I wanted a level of precision in my art. I wanted the lines that I was achieving to be so precise that under magnification, they would still retain their integrity. They would still be a sharp line, no matter how they were magnified. If you if you look at a Van Gogh and take a magnifying glass to the surface, it breaks down. It's not the aesthetic intention of the artist that's revealed in the magnified brushstroke. That's true of Impressionist works, generally. It's not so true of Picasso. Picasso wanted a level of precision that, if you like, could withstand magnification. So did, like, Michelangelo. So did Vermeer. Okay, well, that's what I wanted. So at some point, I only did pastels for about maybe a year or so, a couple of years, but then I started to explore ways of achieving a greater precision of boundary, because I was interested in the nature of objects, and objects are bounded. And so I wanted to investigate the boundaries of things. Well, what I started to do was to paint over the pastel on the glass that's covering that pastel. And that created a contrast between the texture of the pastel and the texture of the acrylic paint on the glass. And that kind of, it advanced me in the direction of what I was aiming for. But one day, I had been painting on the glass over the pastel, and the glass fell away. And I saw the back of the paint through the glass. So the glass was painted on this side. I was looking through, and the edges of that painted glass from the reverse had the sharpness that I was looking for. Okay? So I began to explore that, painting on the underside of glass, painting with my fingers, but also painting with brushes. Okay? At some point, I decided I wanted to make the paint move. And I thought the best way to do that was to to change what's called the refractive index of the medium that we're looking at the painting through. So I decided to run water over the surface of the plastic. So there was the paint, then the plastic, and then water would run over it, and the moving water would create that sense of the dynamic movement, okay? The images would move, okay? As I called these waterworks, okay? I had pumps that I would create compartments for, and they were sculptures, basically sculptures that had water running through them. Unfortunately, they were all destroyed in the earthquake, but otherwise I would have an example to show you. But I lost a couple hundred pieces of art in the earthquake, the Northridge earthquake that I talked about. But one day I was working and I decided to introduce additional elements, little kind of rods into these sculptural works. And one day, as I was working on a sculptural waterwork, one of the rods happened to fall against a painted surface. And it was just a blob of paint, multicolored, on the pole. But when I looked at the paint through the pole, suddenly I saw a world. I saw the inside of the paint. Okay, I saw the inside of the brushstroke. I saw, now it's a little hard to see, I think, here, but if you look, that's the kind of thing. Each one of those is an image. I know it's hard to see here. Basically, what you're looking at is individual brushstrokes. This work with images going from top to bottom, and in this case, they're black and white images, are made up of just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 brushstrokes, okay? And the lines inside the images are precise, so that the pole is magnifying them, and it's also concentrating light, and it's achieving a kind of, for me, aesthetic refinement or perfection. The lines are so sharp, using this method that I was developing, that they can be magnified and still retain a certain beauty, aesthetic intention. Okay, I can show you. Here's like another, example. Each of these, and again, it's hard to see here, is an image, okay? But it's all done with a single brushstroke. Well, I sent one of these poles with just one image on it to IKEA one day, about 15 years ago. And it turned out that when I sent that to them, they had just had a corporate meeting, totally unbeknownst to me, of course, that they were thinking of changing the direction of their company. And what they decided, they were like the leading furniture manufacturer and distributor in the world, okay? One of the leading companies on earth, okay? Well, what they wanted to do, they had decided, was to do for art what they had done for home furnishings. They wanted to change the whole direction of their company. And when I sent them one of these little poles with one painted image, they decided they wanted to do with my art. They loved it. It was exactly what they had been envisioning. Okay? Well, I got an email from IKEA, a short email from their head of business operations saying, we want to change the direction of our company. We want to do it with your art. Can you come to Sweden? Okay? So the next month, can you come to Sweden as soon as possible? So the next month, this is a long story and I keep it very short. The next month, I fly to Sweden with my art. The only problem is that I was represented by a major art dealer in Los Angeles. And my art, those things were selling for thousands of dollars. And my art dealer was afraid that if I did this with IKEA and they started kind of like manufacturing my art and they wanted they wanted me to teach, like it was going to be done, they were going to set up factories in China. And they wanted me to teach Chinese artists how to paint my images in the way I was painting them. And then they would be distributing these throughout the world, right? That's what they wanted. It was a huge kind of enterprise that they were undertaking. My art dealer was horrified. He said, if you do that, it's going to just destroy them. Okay, so he was not enthusiastic about it. So I kind of came up with an alternative, a way to sort of mechanically reproduce. So I go to IKEA. One of the things I wanted to comment on with that too is they asked me when I went there if I could talk to their company, their design group, at their headquarters about whatever I wanted. I talked about philosophy. The point is they were open to all kinds of influences. Okay, they had a talk with me one time. We were talking about patenting stuff, and they said they never patent anything. They never spend any money on patents. They just keep innovating. That's it. They put all their energy into creating new things, not protecting something they've already done. Okay, so anyway, so they were all excited. There were a few problems. I had convinced them that these poles could not be painted the way they wanted them to be painted, but they could be mechanically reproduced. They initially agreed to that, but then they decided that's not what they really wanted to be doing. They wanted to be giving people original art. And then the other problem was they didn't want to do it just with me. They wanted to change the whole direction of their company. They wanted to do it with like a group of artists, and they couldn't find any other artists whose art they thought was suitable for what they were imagining. So, and there were other factors too. So it didn't quite happen. And aside from that, it wasn't like my dream. It's like I'm committed. For me, the art has a different role in my life than to be commercialized in that way. So I wasn't committed to it. So I didn't persevere to make that happen as I might have if that had been my dream, if that had been how I had seen myself. So there's another example of how entrepreneurship succeeds and how it falls short, right? If I really wanted that to happen, it would have taken much more commitment, as a Steve Jobs displays, or an Elon Musk displays, or as I display with my philosophy. Because that is something that I am committed to in a way that I was not committed to commercializing my art through IKEA. Okay, I guess I see Shirin has appeared, so maybe we have some questions. I wanted to say one final thing maybe about Maradona, the great footballer who just died. And let me just say, this country is not a soccer country, as we call it, right? I grew up, even though I have family in England, my mother was English. I went over there a number of times. Their culture embraced it. I was introduced to it, but my sport was baseball. That was my father's sport, and that's what I grew up attached to, not soccer. So I never knew much about Maradona, okay? But last night I watched a 2-hour documentary on him. And I've been reading about him. So now I've educated myself a little bit. And what's fascinating to me is, for Maradona's explanation of his success is that, first of all, it was a mental process, not a physical process. In the same way that I've said, painting, drawing is not a physical process. It's not a matter of being good with your hand. It's a matter of being good with your mind and seeing clearly. Well, Maradona emphasized that soccer is a sport of misdirection and indirection. That the key to his success is you're running a certain direction, people anticipate you're going to continue in that direction, and then you shift. That was the key. He did that relentlessly. He did that on the play that became celebrated as the single greatest goal ever scored in the 1986 World Cup match against England. It's a matter of changing direction, changing expectation. That is a profound process in philosophy, in human life. It is the essence of comedy. Comedy, humor, in the setup of a joke gets you thinking in a certain direction. The humor comes when we suddenly deviate. And that makes us laugh. And the reason it's making us laugh, and the reason it has the value that it does, is it's freeing us from expectation. It's freeing us from the past. And that's an ultimate liberation. And Maradona, in his skill, in his sport, in his art, in the art of it, illustrates that. And it also illustrates the degree to which a single moment can be redemptive of a life. It can all come down to, like, that play, as much as anything, will be what he's remembered for. And that reminds me of something. I'm not going to give you the whole quotation, but there was a famous comment that a music critic made about Beethoven's music, and the value that it has for us, that so long as there is such music in the world, there is always something we can do about the worst that the world can do to us. For eternal life is not a duration, it is an intensity. And that's the kind of intensity of moment that Maradona's life and his achievement embodied. Okay, I think that's a fitting note for me to stop talking tonight.
That's fantastic, actually. And the final part, when you introduced your art, was so amazing. Thank you so much for sharing it with us. I was very much amazed. And also, I also learned 3 points of how to achieve success, maybe. Like, first is persistence, like never giving up and trying all the time, all over again. So as you said before, there is no way we can do things repeatedly again and again. So it's step by step we develop ourselves. Secondly, it's chance, and be at the right time, at the right place to succeed. And third is to evaluate. I mean, knowing what for. These are very important things in order to achieve success or be entrepreneurial, innovative. And thank you so much for sharing it all with us. Your ideas are always very helpful, and it's like a lamp that is getting shed on our brain. So my brain personally. Very appreciate. We do not have questions so far, but if they appear, we probably will answer next time, because it's 1 minute. And I still hope that our learners, our viewers, will watch and rewatch all the time these programs, all these sessions recorded. Please feel free to use YouTube and go online wherever comfortable for you, dear viewers. So you will always be in course you will always know what Stephen talks about, and it is very useful and helpful, and you can actually learn a lot from these talks and like broaden your vision on the world. So it's a bit different perspectives, and at the same time you just learn from the other angles, and this is what important in these talks as well. So Stephen, thank you so much for contributing, for sharing your ideas, and I really hope we can still keep in touch and go on with all the programs we will have.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Shirin. And again, I want to thank you for all your involvement, all your help, all your participation. It's been invaluable. So
it's my big pleasure indeed. So see you next Friday. Goodbye, dear viewers. Bye-bye. Have a nice
day. Good night. Bye-bye.